The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Windsor Castle as Princess Charlotte walked briskly through the ancient corridors. At 19, she carried herself with the poise expected of royalty, yet there was something different about her today. Her usual bright smile seemed forced, and her steps carried an urgency that hadn't been there the day before. Charlotte had always been the darling of the British public. Born into privilege but raised with humility, she represented everything the modern monarchy hoped to embody. Her charitable work with children's hospitals had earned her widespread admiration, and her genuine warmth made her relatable to people from all walks of life. But today, something was troubling the young princess deeply. The previous evening had been particularly difficult. During a private family dinner at Clarence's house, Queen Camilla had made remarks that still echoed in Charlotte's mind. The conversation had started innocently enough, discussing upcoming royal engagements and the princess's growing role within the royal family. But as the evening progressed, Camilla's tone had shifted, becoming increasingly pointed and critical. "Charlotte, darling," Camilla had said, her voice carrying that particular tone that always made the princess uncomfortable. "We need to discuss your future more seriously. The monarchy is changing, and perhaps it's time we considered which members of the family are truly essential to its continuation." The words had hung in the air like a challenge. Charlotte had felt her heart race, understanding immediately the implications behind her step-grandmother's carefully chosen words. This wasn't the first time such conversations had taken place behind closed doors, but it was the first time they had been directed so openly at her. King Charles had remained notably silent during the exchange, focusing intently on his meal while the tension in the room grew thicker. Prince William, Charlotte's father, had shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly caught between loyalty to his stepmother and protection of his daughter. Catherine, Charlotte's mother, had reached across the table to squeeze her daughter's hand, offering what comfort she could in the awkward moment. Now, as Charlotte made her way to meet with Captain James Morrison, her personal protection officer, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was shifting within the royal family. James had been assigned to her protection detail 3 years earlier, and in that time, he had become more than just a bodyguard. He was someone she trusted implicitly, someone who had proven time and again that her safety and well-being were his primary concerns. James was waiting in the private office that had been designated for their security briefings. At 32, he was younger than most senior protection officers, but his military background and sharp instincts had quickly earned him respect within the Royal Protection Unit. His service with the Special Air Service before joining the royal household had prepared him for the unique challenges that came with protecting a member of the royal family. "Your Royal Highness," James stood as Charlotte entered the room, his formal greeting masking the concern he felt at seeing her troubled expression. "Please, James, we've discussed this. When we're alone like this, Charlotte is fine," she said, settling into one of the comfortable chairs near the window that overlooked the castle gardens. James had noticed the change in the princess's demeanor over the past few weeks. The confident young woman who had once bounded into these meetings with enthusiasm and energy seemed increasingly burdened by something she couldn't quite articulate. As her protection officer, it was his job to be aware of all potential threats to her safety, but he was beginning to realize that some of the most dangerous threats might be coming from within the royal family itself. "Is everything all right, Charlotte? You seem troubled today," James said, allowing his professional demeanor to soften slightly. Over the years, their relationship had evolved into something that walked the careful line between professional duty and genuine friendship. Charlotte looked out the window, watching the gardeners tend to the royal roses that would soon bloom in spectacular color. "James, what do you know about succession laws and titles? I mean, really know about them?" The question caught him off guard. James had a basic understanding of royal protocol and succession, but it wasn't typically part of his briefing materials. "I know the basics, but why do you ask? Has something happened?" She turned to face him, and James could see the worry etched across her features. "Last night, during dinner with the family, Queen Camilla made some comments about the future of the monarchy. She suggested that perhaps not all current members of the royal family would be necessary in the years to come." James felt a chill run down his spine. While he maintained a professional distance from palace politics, he had heard whispers among the staff about tensions within the royal family. There had been subtle signs that not everyone was pleased with the direction the monarchy was taking, and Charlotte's growing popularity with the public had apparently become a source of concern for some. What exactly did she say? James asked, his voice carefully neutral. Charlotte recounted the previous evening's conversation, including Camilla's pointed remarks and the uncomfortable silence that had followed. As she spoke, James found himself analyzing the situation from a security perspective. If there were internal conflicts within the royal family regarding Charlotte's position, it could potentially create vulnerabilities that hostile forces might try to exploit. "Has your father spoken to you about this since last night?" James asked. "No, and that's what worries me most," Charlotte replied. "Usually, if there's any kind of family tension, Dad tries to address it quickly. But this morning, he seems to be avoiding me entirely. Even Mum seems unusually quiet about the whole thing." James had served in enough high-stakes situations to recognize when a situation was developing into something more serious. The royal family's internal dynamics weren't typically his concern, but when they began to affect the safety and security of his principal, they very much became his business. "Charlotte, I want you to know that regardless of any family discussions about the future, my job is to ensure your safety and security. That commitment doesn't change based on internal family politics," James said firmly. She looked at him with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, James. I know I can count on you, but I'm starting to worry that this might be bigger than just family disagreements. There have been other conversations, other subtle hints that perhaps my role within the family isn't as secure as I once thought." Over the next hour, Charlotte shared more details about the gradual shift she had noticed in how she was being treated by certain members of the royal household. Staff members who had once been warm and accommodating had become more formal and distant. Invitations to certain family events had become less frequent. Even her official schedule seemed to be managed more carefully, with fewer high-profile engagements and more routine appearances. James listened carefully, filing away each detail and trying to piece together a pattern. His military training had taught him to look for threats from all directions, and what Charlotte was describing sounded very much like a coordinated effort to gradually marginalize her position within the royal family. "Have you noticed any changes in your security arrangements?" James asked. "Any modifications to protocols or staffing that seem unusual?" Charlotte thought for a moment. "Actually, yes. Last week, I was told that my overseas travel would need additional approval going forward. And yesterday, I was informed that my charitable patron positions were being reviewed to ensure they align with the palace's strategic priorities." These revelations confirmed James's growing suspicions. Someone within the royal establishment was systematically working to limit Charlotte's influence and visibility. The question was whether this was simply an internal family matter or if it represented something more concerning. "Charlotte, I think it would be wise for us to document these changes and perhaps seek some informal advice about your rights and position," James suggested. "I have contacts who understand both royal protocol and legal matters who might be able to provide some clarity." She nodded, grateful to have someone taking her concerns seriously. "I've been feeling like I'm going crazy, wondering if I'm imagining things or being overly sensitive, but hearing you say that makes me realize my instincts might be right." As their meeting continued, James began to formulate a plan. His primary responsibility was Charlotte's physical safety, but he was beginning to understand that threats to her position within the royal family could ultimately become threats to her personal security as well. If someone was working to remove her from the line of succession or diminish her role, they might resort to more direct methods if subtle political maneuvering failed. That evening, James conducted his own quiet investigation. Using his security clearance and contacts within the palace staff, he began to gather information about recent changes in Charlotte's treatment and status. What he discovered was more troubling than he had expected. There had indeed been a series of meetings among senior royal advisors discussing the streamlining of the monarchy. Charlotte's name had come up repeatedly in these discussions, with some arguing that her popularity was creating an imbalance that could potentially threaten the stability of the succession. The fact that she was third in line to the throne, after her father and brother Prince George, apparently made some people nervous about her growing public profile. More concerning were the whispered conversations James overheard among certain staff members. There seemed to be a coordinated effort to gradually isolate Charlotte from key decision-making processes and reduce her public visibility. Some of the more senior household staff had apparently received instructions to be more formal and distant in their interactions with the princess. As James compiled his findings, he realized that Charlotte's concerns were not only valid, but potentially more serious than either of them had initially understood. The young princess was facing a carefully orchestrated campaign to diminish her position within the royal family, and the person apparently leading this effort was Queen Camilla herself. The implications were staggering. If successful, this campaign could fundamentally alter Charlotte's future and potentially remove her from meaningful participation in royal duties. But James also understood that such efforts rarely remained purely political. When people's positions and privileges were threatened, they sometimes resorted to more direct and dangerous methods. The next morning, James requested a private meeting with Charlotte to share what he had learned. As he prepared his briefing, he couldn't help but feel that they were standing at the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous than a simple family disagreement. The young princess he had sworn to protect was facing threats from within her own family, and it was becoming clear that his role might need to expand far beyond traditional security concerns. Charlotte arrived for their meeting looking even more troubled than she had the day before. "James, something happened last night that I think you need to know about," she said before he could begin his briefing. "What kind of something?" James asked, immediately alert. "I received a call from my private secretary. Apparently, there's going to be an announcement soon about changes to royal duties and responsibilities. I'm being told that my schedule for the next 6 months is being temporarily adjusted while these changes are implemented." James felt his stomach tighten. The situation was moving faster than he had anticipated, and Charlotte was clearly being positioned as the primary target of whatever changes were coming. As he looked at the young woman who had entrusted him with her safety, he realized that the real battle for her future was just beginning. The following weeks brought a series of subtle but unmistakable changes to Princess Charlotte's life within the royal household. What had begun as vague concerns was now crystallizing into a clear pattern of systematic isolation. James Morrison watched with growing alarm as the young princess found herself increasingly cut off from the inner workings of the monarchy she had been born to serve. The first major blow came during what should have been a routine meeting with the palace's senior staff. Charlotte had been summoned to discuss her upcoming engagements, only to discover that many of her long-standing commitments were being reassigned to other members of the royal family. The children's hospital charity she had championed for 3 years was being transferred to Princess Anne. Her patronage of the Youth Education Foundation was being given to the Duchess of Edinburgh. Even her beloved work with environmental conservation groups was being redistributed. "I don't understand," Charlotte had said, her voice barely concealing her frustration. "These organizations specifically requested my involvement. Some of them I've been working with since I was 16. Sir Geoffrey Hartwell, the palace's deputy private secretary, had delivered the news with a cold efficiency that had made him both feared and respected within royal circles. "Your Royal Highness, these decisions come from the very highest levels. The monarchy is entering a new phase, one that requires a more focused approach to public engagements. We must ensure that royal patronages are aligned with the most strategic priorities." James had been present during this meeting, standing quietly near the door as was protocol for security briefings. But he had watched Charlotte's face as each of her meaningful commitments was stripped away, replaced with what could only be described as ceremonial appearances. Garden parties, ribbon cuttings, and honorary dinners, the kind of engagements that generated publicity but carried little real impact. After the meeting, Charlotte had walked directly to the palace gardens, needing air and space to process what had just happened. James had followed at a respectful distance, maintaining his protective watch while giving her the privacy she needed to absorb the magnitude of what was unfolding. "They're not just reducing my role," Charlotte had finally said, turning to face James as they stood beside the ancient oak tree that had become their unofficial meeting spot. "They're systematically removing everything that gives my position meaning and purpose." James had seen enough during his military service to recognize strategic warfare when he witnessed it. This wasn't random bureaucratic reshuffling. It was a calculated campaign to neutralize Charlotte's influence and public appeal. "Have you spoken to your father about any of this?" "I've tried," Charlotte replied, her voice heavy with disappointment. "But every time I request a private audience, I'm told he's unavailable or the meeting gets postponed indefinitely. It's becoming clear that he either can't or won't intervene on my behalf." The realization that Prince William was either complicit in or powerless to stop what was happening to his daughter represented a crushing blow to Charlotte's sense of security within her own family. Since childhood, she had looked to her father as her protector and advocate within the complex world of royal politics. His apparent abandonment of her during this crisis felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than any external threat could have. James found himself in an increasingly difficult position. His official duty was to provide physical protection for the princess, but the threats she was facing were political and came from within the royal family itself. Traditional security protocols offered little guidance for protecting someone from their own relatives, especially when those relatives wielded the ultimate authority over the royal household. That evening, James made a decision that would have significant consequences for both his career and his relationship with Charlotte. He reached out to Colonel Patricia Blackwood, his former commanding officer from the SAS, who had transitioned into private security consultation for high-profile clients. If anyone would understand the complexities of protecting someone from internal threats, it would be Patricia. They met at a discreet pub in a village outside Windsor, far from any potential palace surveillance. Patricia, a woman in her early 50s whose steel-gray hair and sharp eyes reflected decades of handling dangerous situations, listened carefully as James outlined the developing situation. "So you're telling me that the future Queen of England is being systematically marginalized by her own family, and you're concerned this could escalate beyond political maneuvering?" Patricia asked, her tone suggesting she was already analyzing potential scenarios. "That's exactly what I'm saying," James replied. "Charlotte's popularity with the public is seen as a threat by certain family members. If they can't control her through traditional means, I'm worried they might resort to more direct methods." Patricia nodded thoughtfully. "I've seen similar patterns in corporate succession battles and political dynasties. When subtle pressure doesn't work, people sometimes arrange accidents or scandals to remove obstacles. Has there been any unusual activity around the princess's security arrangements?" James had been tracking exactly that question, and what he had discovered was deeply troubling. Her protection detail has been quietly reduced over the past month. Routes for her official travel have been changed without explanation. And most concerning, there have been several occasions where I've arrived for duty only to be told that my services weren't required for specific engagements. "That's not random," Patricia said grimly. "Someone is creating vulnerabilities in her protection. The question is whether they're doing it to facilitate an attack or simply to demonstrate how isolated and vulnerable she's become." Their conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, with Patricia offering insights from her experience with similar situations. She explained how internal family conflicts often followed predictable patterns, escalating gradually until they reached a point where more drastic measures became attractive to those seeking to consolidate power. "My recommendation," Patricia finally said, "is that you begin documenting everything. Every change to protocol, every unusual instruction, every meeting or engagement where the princess's security is compromised. If this situation continues to escalate, you may need that documentation to protect both her and yourself." James returned to Windsor that night with a new understanding of the gravity of Charlotte's situation. What had begun as family tension was evolving into something that could potentially threaten her safety, and he was the only person in a position to recognize and address that threat. The next morning brought confirmation that Patricia's concerns were well-founded. James arrived at the palace to discover that Charlotte's upcoming visit to a youth center in Birmingham had been canceled without notice. When he inquired about the change, he was told only that security concerns had necessitated the cancellation. However, when James reviewed the threat assessment for that engagement, he found no credible security risks that would justify such a decision. More troubling was what happened when James attempted to access the updated threat assessment that had supposedly prompted the cancellation. His security clearance, which had always provided him access to all information relevant to Charlotte's protection, was suddenly insufficient to view the new report. When he requested clarification from his supervisor, he was told that certain security matters were now being handled at a higher classification level. Charlotte was devastated by the cancellation of the Birmingham visit. The youth center served disadvantaged children from some of the city's most challenging neighborhoods, and her appearance there would have brought both media attention and much-needed funding to their programs. More importantly, it represented the kind of meaningful engagement that gave her royal role purpose and significance. "They're not just changing my schedule," Charlotte said during an emergency meeting in her private sitting room. "They're actively preventing me from doing work that matters. The children at that center were expecting me. The staff had been preparing for weeks." James could see the toll this campaign was taking on the young princess. The confident, enthusiastic woman he had first met 3 years earlier was being systematically broken down by the constant uncertainty and deliberate isolation. Her family's betrayal, combined with the loss of meaningful work, was creating a level of stress that could potentially compromise her judgment and decision-making. "Charlotte, I think we need to consider that this situation may continue to escalate," James said carefully. "I've been reviewing patterns from similar situations, and what you're experiencing often precedes more serious attempts to force someone out of their position entirely." She looked at him with a mixture of fear and determination. "Are you saying they might try to hurt me?" "I'm saying we need to be prepared for all possibilities," James replied. "Your growing isolation isn't just about reducing your influence, it's also making you more vulnerable to various kinds of threats. If someone wanted to arrange an accident or create a scandal, your current situation would make that much easier to accomplish." The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. James was no longer simply Charlotte's protection officer. He was becoming her primary ally in a battle for her survival within the royal family. But as he looked at her troubled face, he realized that the real challenge was only beginning. That afternoon, Queen Camilla requested a private meeting with Charlotte. The summons came through official channels, delivered by one of the senior household staff with the formal language that indicated this was not a social visit. Charlotte was instructed to present herself at Clarence House at precisely 4 o'clock, alone. The specification that she should come alone immediately raised red flags for James. Royal family members rarely met completely without staff present, and Charlotte's current vulnerable position made such a meeting potentially dangerous from multiple perspectives. "I have to go," Charlotte said when James expressed his concerns. "Refusing a direct request from the Queen Consort would only make my situation worse." "Then I'm going with you," James replied firmly. "I'll wait outside the meeting room, but I'm not leaving you completely unprotected in that environment." Charlotte's gratitude was evident in her expression. "Thank you, James. I don't know what I would do without someone I can trust in all of this." As they prepared for the meeting at Clarence House, James found himself reviewing everything he knew about Queen Camilla's character and motivations. She had always been a politically astute woman, someone who understood how to navigate the complex dynamics of royal life to achieve her goals. But she was also someone who had demonstrated a willingness to be ruthless when her position or interests were threatened. The meeting that afternoon would prove to be a crucial moment in Charlotte's struggle to maintain her place within the royal family. As James watched her walk into Clarence House, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were approaching a point of no return in a conflict that would ultimately determine not just Charlotte's future, but potentially the entire direction of the British monarchy. The princess who emerged from that meeting 2 hours later would be fundamentally changed by what she had experienced inside. And James would soon discover that the threats he had been worried about were far more immediate and dangerous than he had ever imagined. The heavy oak doors of Clarence House closed behind Princess Charlotte with a finality that seemed to echo through the ornate hallways. James Morrison positioned himself in the corridor outside Queen Camilla's private study, his senses heightened and alert for any sign of distress from within the room. The meeting that was about to take place would prove to be more confrontational and revealing than either Charlotte or James could have anticipated. Inside the elegantly appointed study, Queen Camilla sat behind an antique mahogany desk that had once belonged to Queen Mary. The positioning was deliberate. She occupied the seat of authority while Charlotte was directed to a smaller chair positioned to face her across the imposing desk. The power dynamic was established before the first word was spoken. "Charlotte, dear," Camilla began, her voice carrying the measured tone she employed when discussing matters of state. "I'm sure you're aware that your position within the family has become a topic of considerable discussion among the senior members of the household." Charlotte straightened in her chair, drawing upon the poise she had been taught since childhood. "I understand there have been changes to my schedule and responsibilities, but I haven't been given any clear explanation for why these changes are necessary." Camilla's smile was perfectly practiced. the expression of someone who had spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of royal politics. The monarchy is evolving, Charlotte. We must adapt to changing times and public expectations. Your father and I have been discussing ways to ensure that the royal family presents a more focused and unified image to the world. And apparently that unified image doesn't include me maintaining meaningful work with the charities and organizations I've supported for years. Charlotte's voice carried a note of challenge that she immediately regretted. Direct confrontation with senior royals was something she had been trained to avoid since childhood. The queen consort's expression hardened slightly, though her smile never wavered. Charlotte, I think you misunderstand your position in this family. You are the second child of the heir to the throne. While that certainly grants you privileges and responsibilities, it also means that your role must be carefully managed to avoid creating confusion about the line of succession. Charlotte felt her heart begin to race as the true nature of this conversation became clear. Are you suggesting that my work with charities creates confusion about succession? I'm suggesting that your growing popularity with certain segments of the public could potentially complicate things for your brother George when he eventually becomes king, Camilla replied, her tone becoming more direct. The monarchy works best when there's a clear understanding of who holds real authority and who plays supporting roles. The implications of Camilla's words were staggering. Charlotte was being told, in carefully diplomatic language, that her success in connecting with the public was seen as a threat to the established order. Her genuine warmth and effectiveness in royal duties had apparently become liabilities rather than assets. I've never done anything to undermine George's position or challenge the succession, Charlotte said, struggling to keep her voice steady. Everything I've done has been in service to the crown and the British people. Camilla leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed intently on Charlotte's face. Intentions matter less than perceptions, my dear, and the perception among certain advisors is that you've been positioning yourself as an alternative to the traditional path of succession. Your mother's influence has perhaps encouraged you to see yourself as more central to the monarchy's future than is appropriate. The mention of Catherine, Princess of Wales, added another layer of complexity to the conversation. Charlotte realized that this wasn't just about her own position. It was also about the broader power dynamics between different branches of the royal family. Camilla was essentially accusing Catherine of encouraging Charlotte to overstep her appropriate role. My mother has only ever encouraged me to serve the crown faithfully and effectively, Charlotte replied, her defensive tone making it clear that Camilla had struck a nerve. Perhaps, Camilla conceded, but faithful service sometimes means accepting limitations and knowing one's place within the hierarchy. Your recent activities have suggested that you may not fully understand those limitations. The conversation continued for another hour, with Camilla systematically dismantling Charlotte's understanding of her role within the royal family. She was told that her overseas travel would be severely restricted going forward, that her charitable patronages would be redistributed to more senior royals, and that her public appearances would be limited to ceremonial functions that posed no risk of overshadowing other family members. Most devastating of all, Camilla informed Charlotte that there were discussions underway about modifying her title and position within the official order of precedence. While she would remain a princess by birth, her active role within the working royal family would be significantly diminished. She would essentially become a ceremonial figure, present for state occasions, but excluded from meaningful royal duties. This isn't fair, Charlotte said, her composure finally beginning to crack. I've dedicated my life to serving this family and this country. I've never done anything to deserve being pushed aside like this. Camilla's response was delivered with the cold precision of someone delivering a final ultimatum. Fairness, my dear Charlotte, is a luxury that royal families cannot always afford. Sometimes difficult decisions must be made for the greater good of the institution. You can accept these changes gracefully and maintain your position within the family, or you can continue to resist and find that your position becomes even more tenuous. The threat was unmistakable. Charlotte was being given a choice: submit to marginalization or face complete exclusion from the royal family. The woman who had once welcomed her warmly into family gatherings was now systematically destroying her future with calm, calculated efficiency. When Charlotte finally emerged from the study, James immediately recognized the signs of someone who had endured a traumatic confrontation. Her face was pale, her hands trembled slightly, and her usual grace had been replaced by the careful movements of someone struggling to maintain control. "How did it go?" James asked quietly as they walked toward the waiting car. Charlotte didn't respond until they were safely inside the vehicle and away from potential listeners within Clarence's house. "She wants me to disappear, James. Not literally, but she wants me to become invisible within the royal family. No meaningful work, no public profile, no influence on anything that matters." As Charlotte recounted the details of her meeting with Camilla, James felt his worst fears being confirmed. This wasn't simply about family politics or managing public perception. It was about power and the lengths some people would go to maintain their position within the hierarchy. "Did she give you any time frame for these changes?" James asked. "She said the formal announcements would begin within the next few weeks," Charlotte replied. "But she also made it clear that if I don't cooperate willingly, things could become much more difficult for me." James recognized the implications immediately. If Charlotte resisted these changes, she could face complete exile from the royal family, loss of her titles, and potentially even threats to her personal safety. The royal family had a long history of dealing harshly with members who were perceived as threats to the established order. That evening, James made another covert call to Colonel Patricia Blackwood. The situation had escalated beyond anything they had previously discussed, and he needed guidance on how to protect Charlotte from threats that were becoming increasingly immediate and personal. "She's being given an ultimatum," James explained during their secure phone conversation. "Accept marginalization or face complete destruction, and I don't think the people making this threat will hesitate to use more direct methods if political pressure doesn't work." Patricia's response was immediate and alarming. "James, you need to understand that you're no longer just dealing with family politics. You're looking at a potential conspiracy to remove someone from the line of succession through coercion and intimidation. If they're willing to go this far, they're probably prepared to go much further." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that Princess Charlotte's life may be in genuine danger," Patricia said bluntly. "When people are willing to destroy someone's entire identity and position within their family, they're often willing to take more permanent steps to ensure that person can't continue to pose a threat." The conversation with Patricia crystallized James's growing understanding of the situation. Charlotte wasn't just facing political maneuvering. She was potentially facing a conspiracy that could threaten her life. And as her protection officer, he was the only person positioned to recognize and counter that threat. The next morning brought news that confirmed James's worst fears. Charlotte's official protection detail was being temporarily reduced due to budget considerations and changing security requirements. James himself was being reassigned to provide security for less senior members of the royal family, effective immediately. When Charlotte learned about James's reassignment, she understood immediately what it meant. The one person within the royal household who had consistently supported and protected her was being removed from his position. She was being systematically isolated and made vulnerable to whatever came next. "They're not even trying to be subtle anymore," Charlotte said during what would be their final official security briefing. "First, they remove my meaningful work, then they threaten my position within the family, and now they're taking away the one person I trust to keep me safe." James faced the most difficult decision of his career. His official duty was to accept his reassignment and continue serving the royal family in whatever capacity he was assigned. But his personal loyalty to Charlotte and his growing understanding of the threats she faced made that impossible to accept. "Charlotte, I want you to know that my reassignment doesn't change anything fundamental about my commitment to your safety," James said carefully. "There may be ways for me to continue providing protection and support that don't depend on official assignments." She looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "James, I can't ask you to risk your career or your future for me. This situation isn't your responsibility." "Yes, it is," James replied firmly. "When I took an oath to protect you, it wasn't conditional on palace politics or family dynamics. You're in danger, and someone needs to stand between you and that danger." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Sir Geoffrey Hartwell entered without waiting for permission, his expression indicating that he was there on official business of the highest importance. "Your Royal Highness," he said, his tone formal and cold, "I'm here to inform you that your official schedule has been cleared for the next month." Additionally, your access to certain palace facilities and resources is being temporarily restricted while security reviews are conducted. Charlotte and James exchanged glances, both understanding that this represented another escalation in the campaign against her. She was being systematically cut off from everything that had defined her role within the royal family. "What kind of security reviews?" Charlotte asked. "I'm not at liberty to discuss the details," Sir Geoffrey replied. "But I can tell you that concerns have been raised about potential security vulnerabilities in your current arrangements. These reviews are necessary to ensure the safety of all members of the royal family." After Sir Geoffrey left, Charlotte and James sat in stunned silence. The restrictions being imposed on her were unlike anything either of them had seen before. Charlotte was essentially being placed under house arrest within her own family's residences. "This is it, isn't it?" Charlotte asked quietly. "This is how they're going to remove me from everything I've worked for. They're going to isolate me completely and then claim it's for security reasons." James nodded grimly. "And once you're completely isolated and vulnerable, they can do whatever they want to ensure you're no longer a threat to their plans." As the reality of Charlotte's situation became fully clear, James made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. He would not abandon her to face this conspiracy alone, even if it meant sacrificing his own career and potentially his own safety. The young woman who had trusted him with her protection deserved better than to be destroyed by the very family she had devoted her life to serving. The battle for Princess Charlotte's future was about to enter its most dangerous phase, and James Morrison was preparing to risk everything to ensure she survived it. The morning after James Morrison's official reassignment, Princess Charlotte found herself more isolated than she had ever been in her life. The corridors of Windsor Castle, which had once felt like home, now seemed filled with suspicious glances and whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she appeared. Staff members who had once greeted her warmly now offered only the most formal acknowledgments before quickly moving away. James had spent the night developing a plan that would allow him to continue protecting Charlotte despite his official reassignment. Using his contacts within the security services and his knowledge of palace protocols, he had identified several ways to maintain surveillance and communication without alerting those who were orchestrating the campaign against her. The first challenge was establishing secure communication channels. James knew that Charlotte's phones and official communications were almost certainly being monitored by palace security services. Anyone seeking to marginalize her would want to know if she was attempting to build support or resistance to their plans. Through Patricia Blackwood's network of security professionals, James acquired encrypted communication devices that would allow him and Charlotte to stay in contact without detection. The handover took place during what appeared to be a chance encounter in one of London's busy shopping districts, far from any palace surveillance. "From now on, use this only for emergency communications," James explained as he discreetly passed Charlotte a device that looked like an ordinary smartphone but was equipped with military-grade encryption. "If you feel threatened or notice anything unusual, contact me immediately." Charlotte's relief at having a lifeline to James was evident, but she was also deeply troubled by the necessity of such precautions. "I can't believe I need a secret phone to communicate with my own protection officer. What has my life become?" The answer to that question became clearer over the following days as Charlotte discovered the full extent of her isolation. Her official car and driver were reassigned to other duties, forcing her to rely on public transportation or arrange private travel at her own expense. Her access to palace staff and resources was restricted to essential services only. Even her private secretary was replaced with someone who clearly reported directly to senior household officials, rather than serving Charlotte's interests. Most devastating was the discovery that her parents, Prince William and Catherine, had apparently accepted her marginalization as inevitable. When Charlotte finally managed to secure a brief private meeting with her father, his response was both heartbreaking and revealing. "Charlotte, you must understand that sometimes sacrifices must be made for the greater good of the monarchy," William had said, his voice heavy with what appeared to be genuine regret. "Camilla has convinced your grandfather that changes are necessary to ensure stability during the transition to his reign and beyond." "And you agree with that?" Charlotte had asked, her voice barely concealing her disbelief. William's silence spoke volumes. He might not agree with what was happening to his daughter, but he was either unwilling or unable to challenge the decisions being made by King Charles and Queen Camilla. Charlotte realized that she truly was alone in this battle, abandoned even by the parents who had once been her strongest supporters. James, meanwhile, had begun conducting his own investigation into the broader conspiracy that was targeting Charlotte. Using his security clearance and contacts within various intelligence services, he was piecing together a picture that was far more complex and dangerous than either he or Charlotte had initially understood. The campaign against Charlotte wasn't simply about family politics or managing succession issues. There were financial and political interests at stake that extended far beyond the royal family itself. Certain business relationships and international diplomatic arrangements apparently required a more compliant and controllable royal family, one that wouldn't challenge established power structures with inconvenient moral stands or popular appeal. Charlotte's work with children's charities had led her to question government policies regarding child welfare and education funding. Her environmental advocacy had put her at odds with several major corporations that had important relationships with the royal household. Her genuine connection with working-class communities had made her a symbol of social consciousness that some powerful interests found threatening. "She's not just being removed because she's popular," Patricia explained during one of James's covert briefings. "She's being removed because her popularity is the wrong kind. She represents values and priorities that certain people want to eliminate from the royal family's public image." This broader understanding of the conspiracy made James realize that Charlotte's situation was even more precarious than they had thought. If powerful business and political interests were involved in marginalizing her, they would have resources and influence that extended far beyond the royal household itself. The first attempt to directly threaten Charlotte came 3 weeks after James's reassignment. She was leaving a private appointment with her dentist in central London when her new, inexperienced protection officer somehow became separated from her in the busy streets. Charlotte found herself alone and vulnerable for nearly 20 minutes before James, who had been conducting his own surveillance, was able to locate and assist her. During those 20 minutes, Charlotte was approached by 2 men who claimed to be journalists but whose behavior was far more threatening than professional. They followed her through several streets, asking increasingly personal and aggressive questions about her relationship with her family and her future plans. When she attempted to ignore them, they became more persistent and physical in their approach. James's arrival ended the confrontation, but the message was clear. Charlotte could be isolated and threatened whenever those orchestrating the campaign against her chose to do so. Her official protection was either incompetent or deliberately inadequate, leaving her vulnerable to various forms of intimidation. That night, Charlotte made a decision that would fundamentally change her approach to the crisis she was facing. Instead of continuing to react defensively to each new threat and restriction, she decided to take proactive steps to protect herself and expose what was being done to her. "James, I need to document everything that's happening," she said during a clandestine meeting in a small cafe far from central London. "If they're going to destroy my life and my position, I want there to be a record of how they did it and why." James had been thinking along similar lines. "I've already begun keeping detailed records of all the unusual security changes and restrictions, but if you're serious about documenting this, we'll need to be much more systematic and careful about it." Together, they developed a plan to secretly record and document the campaign being waged against Charlotte. Using the technical resources provided by Patricia's network, they would gather evidence of the conspiracy while continuing to protect Charlotte from immediate threats to her safety. The plan required Charlotte to continue participating in the restricted activities she was allowed, while secretly recording her interactions with senior household staff and family members. It was dangerous work that could result in even more severe consequences if discovered. But both Charlotte and James understood that without evidence, her accusations would never be believed by the public or the media. The breakthrough came when Charlotte was summoned to another meeting with Queen Camilla, this time at Buckingham Palace. Using a concealed recording device provided by James, she was able to capture a conversation that revealed the true scope and motivation behind the campaign against her. "Charlotte," Camilla said during their private meeting, "I want you to understand that what's happening to you isn't personal. It's simply business. There are expectations and commitments that the royal family must meet, and your particular approach to royal duties has become incompatible with those requirements." "What kind of commitments?" Charlotte asked, genuinely confused by Camilla's reference to business obligations. Camilla's response was more revealing than she probably intended. "The monarchy operates within a complex web of relationships with government, business, and international partners. Your advocacy work and public statements have created complications for several important relationships that are crucial to the family's long-term stability and influence." The recording captured Camilla explicitly acknowledging that Charlotte was being marginalized because her advocacy work conflicted with unnamed business and political interests. It was the first concrete evidence that the campaign against Charlotte was motivated by factors that extended far beyond internal family dynamics. But the most damaging revelation came when Camilla discussed Charlotte's future with startling candor. "If you continue to resist these necessary changes, Charlotte, we may have no choice but to consider more permanent solutions to the problems your position is creating." The threat was unmistakable, even though it was delivered in the polite language of royal diplomacy. Charlotte was being warned that her continued resistance could result in consequences that went far beyond losing her royal duties and privileges. When Charlotte shared the recording with James that evening, both of them understood that they had crossed a crucial threshold. They now had evidence of a conspiracy that involved threats against a member of the royal family, but possessing that evidence also put them in significantly greater danger. "We have proof now," James said as they listened to the recording in a secure location. "But we also have to assume that if they're willing to make direct threats, they're prepared to carry them out if necessary." Charlotte's response revealed how much she had changed during the weeks of pressure and isolation. The naive young woman who had once trusted completely in her family's protection was gone, replaced by someone who understood that her survival depended on her own strength and the loyalty of the few people willing to stand with her. "Then we need to be prepared to defend ourselves," she said with a determination that surprised James. "I won't let them destroy me without a fight, and I won't let them destroy what the monarchy could become if it were free from this kind of corruption." As they planned their next steps, both Charlotte and James understood that they were moving into the most dangerous phase of their battle. They had evidence of the conspiracy against her, but using that evidence would require them to challenge some of the most powerful people in Britain. The young princess and her loyal protector were about to declare war on the very institution they had sworn to serve, and the consequences of that decision would determine not just Charlotte's future, but potentially the future of the British monarchy itself. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose the dark reality behind the public facade of royal life, with Princess Charlotte and James Morrison standing against forces that had never expected to face any serious resistance to their plans. The question was whether their evidence and determination would be enough to overcome the vast power and resources arrayed against them. The final confrontation began not with drama or ceremony, but with a simple phone call that Princess Charlotte received on a cold Thursday morning in November. The voice on the other end belonged to Sir Geoffrey Hartwell, and his message was delivered with the cold precision that had become his trademark when dealing with Charlotte's increasingly desperate situation. "Your Royal Highness, you are requested to attend a formal meeting at Buckingham Palace tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock. The King, Queen Camilla, and other senior family members will be present to discuss your future role within the royal family." Charlotte understood immediately that this was not a request, but an ultimatum. The formal language and the specification that other senior family members would be present indicated that this would be her final opportunity to accept the marginalization that had been systematically imposed upon her over the past months. James Morrison, who had been monitoring Charlotte's communications through their secure channels, recognized the significance of this summons. In his experience, formal meetings of this type were typically used to present someone with a fait accompli rather than to engage in genuine negotiation. Charlotte was being called to receive her final terms of surrender. "This is it," James said during an emergency meeting in a safe house that Patricia Blackwood had arranged for their most sensitive discussions. "They're going to present you with the choice between complete submission or total exile from the family. And based on everything we've documented, I suspect they have no intention of allowing you to choose exile." Charlotte had spent the previous night reviewing all the evidence they had gathered over the months of systematic persecution she had endured. The recordings, documents, and witness testimonies painted a picture of a conspiracy that extended far beyond family politics into the realm of genuine criminal activity. The threats, intimidation, and deliberate isolation she had experienced constituted a pattern of abuse that would be illegal if directed against any private citizen. "I'm not going to that meeting to surrender," Charlotte announced with a resolve that surprised even James. "I'm going to confront them with everything we've learned and demand that they stop this campaign of destruction." James felt a chill of fear at her words. "Charlotte, you have to understand that confronting them directly could be extremely dangerous. These people have demonstrated that they're willing to use threats and intimidation. If you challenge them openly, they may resort to more direct methods." "Then we need to make sure that more direct methods would be too risky for them to attempt," Charlotte replied. "If they know that everything we've discovered will become public if anything happens to me, they'll be forced to find another way to handle this situation." The plan that Charlotte and James developed over the next 24 hours was both audacious and dangerous. They would use the formal meeting at Buckingham Palace to expose the conspiracy, but only after taking steps to ensure that their evidence would be made public regardless of what happened to them during the confrontation. Patricia Blackwood coordinated the security arrangements, working with trusted contacts in the media and legal community to create a network of safeguards that would activate automatically if Charlotte or James failed to check in at predetermined times. The evidence they had gathered was distributed to multiple secure locations, with instructions for its release if anything happened to prevent Charlotte from continuing her fight. The morning of the meeting, Charlotte made a decision that demonstrated how completely she had transformed from the naive young princess who had first sought James's help. She chose to wear the same simple black dress she had worn to her grandmother Queen Elizabeth's funeral, understanding that the symbolism would not be lost on anyone present at the palace. "I'm going to that meeting as myself, not as the controlled and diminished version of myself they want me to become," she explained to James as they made their final preparations. "If they want to remove me from the royal family, they're going to have to do it to the real Princess Charlotte, not to some broken and submissive version they've tried to create." James accompanied Charlotte to Buckingham Palace in his capacity as her protection officer, a role he was technically no longer authorized to perform, but which no one had yet explicitly forbidden him from fulfilling. His presence sent a clear message that Charlotte was not coming to the meeting as an isolated and vulnerable victim, but as someone who still had allies willing to stand with her. The meeting took place in the same stateroom where Charlotte had attended countless family gatherings throughout her life. But the atmosphere that greeted her was unlike anything she had ever experienced within her own family's home. King Charles sat at the head of a long conference table, his expression grave and distant. Queen Camilla occupied the chair to his right, her face displaying the cold satisfaction of someone who believed they were about to achieve a long-sought victory. Prince William and Catherine were present, but they sat apart from the main group and avoided making eye contact with their daughter. Their body language made it clear that they had been effectively neutralized in this conflict, either through threats or promises that had convinced them to abandon Charlotte to her fate. Also present were several individuals whom Charlotte had never seen before, lawyers and advisors, whose presence indicated that this meeting was about much more than family relationships. They were there to ensure that whatever was decided would be legally binding and irreversible. Sir Geoffrey Hartwell opened the proceedings with a formal statement that outlined the concerns that had prompted this meeting. He spoke of Charlotte's increasingly problematic behavior and her failure to understand her appropriate role within the royal family hierarchy. He referenced security risks and diplomatic complications that her continued prominence was creating. When Sir Geoffrey finished his presentation, King Charles addressed his granddaughter directly for the first time since she had entered the room. "Charlotte, we have prepared a new role for you within the family that we believe will be more suitable for your temperament and abilities. You will retain your title and your place in the succession, but your public duties will be significantly reduced and more carefully managed." The new role that was outlined for Charlotte amounted to virtual house arrest. She would be permitted to attend major state occasions and family celebrations, but her public schedule would be eliminated entirely. Her charitable work would end. Her access to media and public platforms would be terminated. She would essentially become a decorative presence at royal events with no independent voice or influence. In return for accepting this arrangement, Queen Camilla added. You will continue to receive financial support from the royal family and maintain your residence within royal properties. It's a generous offer that recognizes both your position within the family and the necessity of managing certain complications your previous activities have created. Charlotte listened to the terms being imposed upon her with growing anger and determination. When they finished speaking, she stood slowly and faced the assembled group with the poise and dignity that had made her so beloved by the British public. Before I respond to your proposal, Charlotte began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room, I think you should be aware of some information I've gathered about how this situation has developed. The change in atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. Sir Geoffrey started to object, but Charlotte continued speaking without acknowledging his interruption. Over the past several months, I have been the target of a systematic campaign of intimidation and isolation that goes far beyond any legitimate concerns about royal protocol or family hierarchy. I have recordings and documents that demonstrate that this campaign has been motivated not by my behavior, but by my refusal to abandon advocacy work that conflicts with certain business and political interests. Queen Camilla's face flushed with anger, but her voice remained controlled. Charlotte, you're clearly distraught and confused about what has been happening. Perhaps it would be better if you took some time to consider our offer before making any hasty statements. I'm not confused, Charlotte replied firmly. I have recordings of conversations where you explicitly acknowledged that my removal from active royal duties is being demanded by unnamed business partners and political interests. I have documentation of security procedures being deliberately compromised to make me vulnerable to intimidation. I have evidence of a conspiracy to remove me from meaningful royal duties through threats and coercion. The silence that followed Charlotte's statement was deafening. King Charles looked genuinely shocked, suggesting that he may not have been fully aware of the methods being used to achieve goals he had approved. Prince William appeared stricken, perhaps realizing for the first time the full extent of what his daughter had been enduring. But Queen Camilla's reaction was the most revealing. Instead of denying Charlotte's accusations or expressing surprise, she simply looked across the table with cold calculation, clearly assessing how to minimize the damage from these revelations. Even if such recordings existed, Camilla finally said, they would prove nothing illegal or improper. The royal family has every right to manage its internal affairs and make decisions about how family members participate in public duties. Charlotte's response demonstrated how much she had learned during her months of isolation and persecution. That's true when those decisions are made legitimately through proper family channels. But it's not true when those decisions are made through intimidation, threats, and deliberate sabotage of security arrangements. And it's definitely not true when those decisions are being made to serve the interests of outside parties rather than the royal family itself. James, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, now stepped forward slightly, his presence serving as a reminder that Charlotte was not facing this moment alone. Several of the lawyers and advisors in the room noticed his movement and exchanged concerned glances. King Charles finally spoke, his voice heavy with what appeared to be genuine distress. Charlotte, if what you're saying is true, then mistakes have been made that need to be corrected. But this is a family matter that should be resolved privately, not something that should be discussed in public forums. I agree that it should have been resolved privately, Charlotte replied. But when private efforts to address the situation were ignored or suppressed, public exposure became the only remaining option. Queen Camilla stood abruptly, her composure finally cracking under the pressure of Charlotte's accusations. You have no idea what you're doing, Charlotte. You're a naive young woman who thinks she understands forces and relationships that are far beyond your comprehension. If you proceed with these accusations, you will destroy not just your own future, but potentially the stability of the entire monarchy. Charlotte's response was delivered with a calm authority that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. The monarchy I was raised to serve was supposed to be about duty, service, and moral leadership. If exposing corruption and intimidation threatens that institution, then perhaps the problem isn't with my accusations, but with what the institution has allowed itself to become. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, with various attempts to negotiate a compromise that would satisfy Charlotte while protecting the interests of those who had orchestrated the campaign against her. But Charlotte had moved beyond the possibility of compromise. She demanded a complete investigation of the conspiracy she had uncovered, the punishment of those responsible and fundamental changes to prevent similar abuses in the future. When it became clear that no agreement was possible, the meeting ended with an explicit threat from Queen Camilla. "If you proceed with these accusations, Charlotte, you will be entirely on your own. The royal family will not protect you from the consequences of your choices." Charlotte's response was immediate and unwavering. "I've been on my own throughout this entire ordeal. The difference now is that I have evidence to prove what has been done to me, and I have people willing to stand with me in demanding justice." As Charlotte and James left Buckingham Palace that afternoon, both understood that their battle had entered a new and even more dangerous phase. They had openly declared war on some of the most powerful people in Britain, and those people would not simply accept defeat without attempting to destroy their accusers. But Charlotte had also discovered something about herself during the months of persecution and the confrontation that had just ended. She was stronger and more determined than anyone, including herself, had realized. The naive princess who had once trusted blindly in her family's protection was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that true loyalty sometimes required challenging those in authority. The story of Princess Charlotte's fight for her position within the royal family was far from over, but she had already achieved something remarkable. She had refused to be silently eliminated, and she had forced those who sought to destroy her to face the consequences of their actions. Whether she would ultimately succeed in reforming the institution she had been born to serve remained to be seen, but she had already proven that even princesses could fight back when their fundamental rights and dignity were threatened. The young woman who walked out of Buckingham Palace that day was no longer just a princess fighting for her title. She had become a symbol of resistance against the abuse of power, even when that power was wielded by her own family. And James Morrison, the royal guard who had chosen to defend her when everyone else had abandoned her, had proven that true loyalty sometimes meant standing against authority rather than blindly serving it.